Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston. Now, if this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that could appeal to you, I would love it if you'd hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today, we're taking a look at the Poly Ample. PolyFX is the kind of brand that seems hell-bent on making sure that they are never outdone. Whether it is their earlier stuff like the Bebo and the Hector, which have gone on to receive numerous updates over the years, adding such a myriad wealth of features that I actually can't keep track of what's in those devices anymore, all the way through to their most recent release before now, the Polyverbs, a stereo IR loader focused on getting as many real-world and non-traditional reverb sounds in the form of IR files as possible onto your pedal board. And following in that format, Poly is now releasing the Ample, which is essentially the same concept, but for amplifiers. An Ample is a really fascinating product. It is 56 different amplifiers kind of captured and loaded into the same general form factor as the Polyverbs, with a series of 8 presets down the middle and categories across the top. And what that means is Poly has categorized all of these amps into Clean, Crunch, Destroy, Classic USA, Classic UK, Gen X, and Bass, which means yes, there are indeed 8 different bass amps in this thing as well. So if you're a bass player who is constantly, like I often am, annoyed by the lack of love and attention that bass gets in amp-in-a-box solutions, rejoice, you have a ton of options here. One of the things that I find so compelling about the decision to put 56 different amplifiers in this thing is not only do you have the mainstays, but because they are essentially captures or snapshots of these amplifiers, you actually can end up with really specific amplifiers, not just the broad gesturing towards an AC30, but a specific early 60s AC30, a series of 50s and 60s Fender amplifiers, and a bunch of different Fender amplifiers. You're not just getting one kind of catch-all in the form of a kind of Fender Twin with the edges rounded off. But what I think is so compelling about this as a device is its inclusion of a lot of boutique amps, some of the kind of like best in show examples from brands that we on this channel and people who watch my channel often know and love, but maybe don't have access to in the vast majority of their lives. Things like a Benson Chimera, amps from Milkman and Morgan and Turok, and even a Matchless. And those are some of the most compelling inclusions to me when it comes to this thing, because I don't really own classic amplifiers in my studio. As I look around right now, I'm looking at things like a Victory Deputy, and there's a Sheriff in here. I have a Morgan PR12, and there's a Morgan JS12 in here. I have my Benson Monarch behind me, and there is a Benson Chimera in this device. I really like the kind of modern boutique takes on some classic circuits and some modern unique takes that are completely their own, and to have those represented in a device like this that is not put upon me to do my own captures is actually really inspiring and really encouraging when it comes to kind of pulling up sounds to write with. But also, as somebody who is a self-avowed not a guitar player's guitar player, the inclusion of a lot of classics and noteworthy, less famous amplifiers in here is really cool too. There are Brunos, ADAs, and Soldanos. These are amp names and amp brands that I recognize but don't have a strong point of reference for. And for me to be able to kind of pull some of those sounds in this and use them, all of the lead guitar parts on the second half of that song are all with the Friedman amp in here, a brand that I've never played in my entire life. When it comes to dialing these amps in, you have a gain and a volume, as well as a bass and a treble, and the ability to kind of re-tap on the preset you're currently on to access a secondary set of features, things like a mid-range control, which is very welcome, as well as a room control and a boost for being able to push more gain out of any amp model you pull up in this thing. You have MIDI in and out and a USB-C port on the back, as well as the ability to split amps left and right. So by triple tapping on the little Poly Ample logo right here, you can actually isolate out your left and your right channels and select different amplifiers with different settings for each channel. Between that and the ability to defeat the cabinets in this thing, because of course every single amp in here has a matched IR cabinet built into it, you have the ability to use perfectly matched and tuned combinations as a single amp or two separate amps, or to defeat those cabinets and run it to your own IR loader or cab sim that you prefer as well. There's not a lot to dislike about what Ample can do and how it sounds. In fact, about the only thing I do dislike about this device is the interface. I didn't really talk much about dislike for the Poly interface, this kind of touchscreen, smooth, light-based system when I did the Verbs video, because in earnest, for the Verbs video, it didn't really bother me that much. It's not the most precise system in the world, but when it comes to just switching reverb algorithms and adjusting your kind of decay in your mix, I didn't find myself too put off by it. But in this context where there are multiple menu options that require you to triple tap on one of the icons, and you're dealing with what feels to me, in my experience, like about a 70% hit rate when it comes to these icons, it's really frustrating when you're deep into kind of dialing in your sound, when you're auditioning amplifiers, trying to kind of like work through quickly to find the sound you want for the next part. You end up slowing down, or at least I end up slowing down a lot trying to work through this system. I'm a very tactile person. I barely have the patience to dial plugins in my DAW, and have been building out the outboard gear studio side of my room here purely for the fact that I don't want to be on my mouse and keyboard getting sounds while I'm trying to record. And so for somebody like me with those tendencies, any amount of friction when it comes to the UI is going to put me off. But this UI specifically puts me off more aggressively. I just wish that it was either more sensitive. I would take some of the errors that would come with that in favor of this idea that I'm just sitting here triple tapping over and over again on the same icon, and it's taking me 3 or 4 tries to kind of either split my amps or bring them back together. But of course, 2 things are really important here. Number 1 is your mileage may vary. Maybe I am not good at navigating this interface, and maybe you have bought something like the Verbs or their drive pedal that uses this same interface and have had nothing but success with it. Number 2, and I think this is the kind of key and crucial one, with MIDI, you can bypass pretty much all of that stuff in favor of sending MIDI commands to find the sounds you want in here. And if it sounds good, it's probably just worth it. So with that in mind, let's go to our sound samples. Let's put Ample back on the board and run through not every amp model, but what I think are some of my favorite showings from classic, boutique, and somewhat off the beaten path amplifiers in each of these categories to really just kind of get a greatest hits of what I think Ample brings to the table. Mark from the future here, kind of post-mixing, post-editing, and I wanted to just jump back in and add a few more bits of necessary context as well as a couple extra thoughts before we get into our sound samples. Number 1 is, in that review portion that we just kind of talked through, overviewing what Ample is, I realize I use terms like capture and snapshot, but I don't actually, 1, know if those are accurate terminology. Those are phrases and terms that I have picked up from brands I work with that use similar methods for capturing amplifiers. And number 2, that I wasn't actually clear about what this technology is. Ample is running something called Neural Amp Modeler, which is a piece of software that does amp modeling and amp capturing, or whatever you want to call it. And not related to Neural DSP. This is a different neural amp system. And this is basically a hardware unit running the software that is Neural Amp Modeler's kind of program. So I want to be very clear about that, because I know otherwise we're going to get confusion in the comments and everything. So this is running the Neural Amp Modeler as a hardware unit. And number 2 is running through the sound samples calls into high relief, in my opinion at least. And to just interject some of my thoughts here, how much the electric guitar, in my opinion, at its best is not a solo instrument, is not at its best in an isolated environment, which is not to say that these are not going to sound good. I think that these sound samples we're about to head into, to varying extents, sound good, pretty good, and great. We call up some of kind of my favorite models of the 56 amps in this thing. I think that things like the Ample, things like real amplifiers, things like amp-in-a-box solutions are best judged in context of a song. I think it's important to hear them as sound samples like we're about to, but I have found that I don't actually want the biggest, widest guitar tone in the world. I want something that feels like it slots into a mix effectively because I want it to be an effective songwriting tool. And I think that the Ample does an amazing job at that. I think that these sound samples are going to sound pretty good, but I think that in the context of that intro song is where Ample really shines. And so, yeah, I think that it's important sometimes as we get really focused on pedals and gear and amps and the electric guitar as its kind of sole focus thing. I find myself often having to kind of course correct and go, yeah, this sounds good or this sounds okay or whatever, but does it serve a song? Because I have gear that is amazing and doesn't serve a song well. And I do want to give credit, I do want to give props to Loki and Polly for creating something that really does, in my opinion, serve songwriting effectively. So let's give it a listen. So as always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I am playing my Jennings Navigator with McNelly Stagger Swagger pickups into the 29 pedals EUNA, the Cali 76 FET compressor from Origin Effects, the Quiet Theory Prelude delay and reverb, and the Benson Germanium boost. From there, we go into the Poly Ample mono in and stereo out, into the Strymon El Capistan and the Maris Mercury 7. If we bypass the Poly itself, this is what our clean tone sounds like. So this is just going to be guitar directly into a pair of warm WA273 preamps. So let's go ahead and start things off by taking a look at the bank of clean amplifiers. So like we said in that review section, rather than looking at every single amplifier in this thing, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of what I would consider to be those greatest hits of each kind of category of amplifier, as well as the kind of control scheme that controls them all. And at the tail end, we will take a look at that amp splitting functionality to kind of hear how you can pair two different amps for kind of more interesting and complex tones. We're going to take special care as well to highlight some of the amps that we used on that intro track, because like I said, I think this thing sounds pretty good in isolation, but sits really well into a greater mix context. So as we jump into this clean bank, let's start by taking a look at the Tone King Imperial model. This is one of the ones that I was immediately drawn to because every iteration of a Tone King I've listened to, I've really liked. But this is also the amp that I used on that intro track for the kind of ambient interlude going from the kind of verse section to that heavier section at the end. So by pulling in our Benson boost, a compressor, and a delay and a reverb, we have access to that. Which just sounds excellent. Another strong showing from this section of the pedal is going to be the inclusion of a couple of Magnatone amplifiers. And like I said earlier, that's one of those things that I love about this thing, the fact that you have access to some amplifiers that have earned their reputation but are not mainstream enough that I've ever been in a room with one. I know Magnatone by the name, but I don't actually have a strong sense of what they sound like, and I really enjoy the model in here. So jumping right here, number 6, you have a Magnatone Twilighter. With the ability to tap again to jump into those secondary controls. We You can mess with things like the mid-range by controlling the secondary on that bass. Adjusting the amount of room. Or even the amount of boost you want when you kind of activate that A side boost control. Which is really rad. And of course, in here, you also have something like this Zinky, which is an amp company I've never even heard of, but let's go ahead and take a look at some of my favorites from the crunch section, which might also be my actual favorite section of this entire device. It's definitely the area that we pulled a majority of the tones from that intro track from. Right up top, you have a Fuchs ODS 100, which yet again is an amp that I've never come across in my life, but ends up sounding great anyways, which is such a trip. And it's that kind of really great, kind of mid-rangey thing that benefits from a little bit of extra treble. But again, you give it some plate reverb and some delay. And it's the kind of thing that slots into a mix really, really nicely. Number 4 in this section is going to be a Victory Sheriff, which is a very plexi style amplifier, and one of my kind of like favorite iterations of that particular brand of Marshall amp style. We use this on all of the rhythm parts for that intro track. I find this one kind of benefits from a cranking of the gain, slight reduction of volume, because the kind of pairing of gain and volume in this thing don't really create that amp compression thing. It instead just gets loud and runs the risk of being so loud that it can clip some of your pedals that come after it or your preamps if you're not being careful. It's a great sounding version of that kind of thing. I really enjoy it. And when you crank that treble, it gets a good amount of clarity brought back in. I love how wide of a definition crunch can have, because in this same category, you have that. And you also have something like the Morgan JS12, which is very much a kind of Princeton lineage style amplifier. Pairs really nicely with that big room that they've recorded for this. And a personal favorite of mine, and also a really good litmus test for Poly as a device, is going to be that Benson Chimera. I will say, this is one of the amps that I am more familiar with in terms of what the real version of it sounds like. And this is where the kind of like accuracy side of Ample starts to kind of show a little bit of cracks. And that can be in part because I am not getting to mic up a Benson the way that I would kind of prefer to in this context. But it's also because you will always lose something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you will always lose some element in the translation. Having said that, taking something like this Benson Chimera, doing what I would normally do to one, which is like a slight bass decrease and a slight treble increase. And then putting it in context of a pedal board. You find that those changes, those errors in translation matter less and less. And so it goes for adding it to a pedalboard context, and as the same it goes for putting it into your mix. I use that Chimera on a bunch of that intro track, and I mean, let's be real. It just sounds good. At a certain point, I don't care if it's a one-to-one comparison. I care if it works in the mix of the song, and the Chimera in this thing works in the mix of a song. Moving into the Destroy section of this pedal, you have your high gain, kind of like riffy amplifiers. But again, even in this context, you're casting a pretty wide net. Amp number one is going to be an Engel Powerball, which is an amp that I am not familiar with. And if we're being totally transparent, I'm not that big of a fan of in this context, but I think I probably wouldn't be that big of a fan of it in any context. It just has that thing to it, which calls in my mind for an immediate increase of mid-range. But because we are talking about a device that does not trade in only one sound per mode, what you can do is immediately jump over to something like number 4, which is a Friedman BE50 Deluxe, which is what we use on all the lead parts with that single coil 52 style telly on the intro. You also have something like this PRS Archon, which is, again, when we talk about amps that sound good in a mix, regardless of how they sound in isolation, this is very much what I think is like when I think of like studio rhythm guitar. Like that's mid-rangey and boxy and not that present. But like for a lot of like rhythm guitar, you don't want a lot of cut and a lot of bite for a lot of conventional genres of rock and roll. And being able to kind of pull something like that out of this device, give it a little bit more gain. Is actually kind of perfect. Like that would sit really, really nicely alongside a bass guitar in a more kind of like complex and full sounding mix. And of course, this is the only place in the world I'm probably going to be playing a Sun Model T. I think I said this before, but one of the things I find so valuable about this particular brand of amp-in-a-box solutions is the fact that when it comes to a Fender amplifier, you are not dealing in a singular catch-all Fender amp that is an approximation of a deluxe reverb or a Fender Twin that has the edges sanded down, and it's basically just a stand-in for quote-unquote clean pedal platform, because there are a lot of flavors of Fender amp, and a lot of them are not pedal platforms. So let's give a listen to the classic USA collection highlights and the fact that in this mode with 8 amplifiers, 6 of them are just Fender amplifiers, and then a Music Man and a Silvertone at the very tail end. We have a Vibrolux, a Princeton, a Dual Showman, a Deluxe Reverb, a Super Reverb, and a Twin Reverb, and each one has its own place available to you here. This is going to be one of the only areas where we probably run through every single amp, and that's mostly because we're not going to change settings. I just want to showcase how different Fender amps are from position to position, and that a USA clean amplifier is not a monolith. So that is a Vibrolux. And this, in turn, is a Princeton. Followed by a Dual Showman. Again, we're not even going to bother doing anything but like volume correcting for this section. We're just highlighting the value here. And a Deluxe. A Super Reverb. a twin, yeah, those are 6 different Fender amps, and with a few mild exceptions, nothing really sounds that much like anything else. Wrapping up this section, we have our only 2 non-Fender amps that apparently have ever been made in the United States. Oh well. A Music Man 212-65. And an amp that I have always really loved, the Silvertone 1484, just like a classic suitcasey sounding boxy amp that has just always been like ripping in all the fun ways. One of the better like breakup-y amps in this section. Jumping over to the classic UK collection, which is almost the polar opposite in every way from the clean USA collection, where the USA one is 6 Fender amps and 2 other amplifiers. The Classics UK is a Watkins and a Hiwatt, a Sound City, a Vox, a Matt amp, an Orange, a Marshall, and a different Marshall. And the 2 Marshalls don't really sound anything alike anyways. It's the UK does variety better than we do, is what we're learning in this video. We're going to go back to kind of picking and choosing here, and we are going to start things off with that Hiwatt, because I think the Hiwatt is amazing, and I really love these amps and don't get to play them. A classic example of like just massive clean tone. It's also essential to go ahead and take a look at the AC30 in here because it's an AC30. And it does that AC30. This might be one of the most accurate to the thing it emulates amps in this thing, in my opinion. I've always been such a massive fan of the AC30 for its kind of like articulation when you dig in a little bit, especially in like an ambient context. ultimately, at the end of the day, we keep circling back to, does it sound good? Would it work in a mix? And that's an amp that works in a mix. You, of course, have an orange in here, which is going to start gainier than a lot of these other amps have, and really afford you that. And of course, you have two different flavors of Marshall in here. You have a JTM 45 and a JMP Super Lead, which we're going to listen to and see if we can kind of push it into that classic Super Lead territory. Again, because these are kind of neural amp models of these things and not like full recreations, you are going to be somewhat limited in how much you can grab versus how it was captured in the first place. Let's give it a little bit more bass. Pull down that volume, crank that gain. Jumping over to the Gen X section here, you're going to have kind of the biggest kind of like selection of different vibes, gain stages, and voicings of amplifiers. You've got like everything from an ADA to a JCM 800, a Matchless, a Mesa, a JC 120, so a keyboard amp, Sovtex, Soldanos, and even a Carvin. We're going to go ahead and start things off by listening to the Matchless Phoenix, which is, again, this fascinating thing. Matchless, a company I love, but the Phoenix, an amp I've never heard in my entire life. Right next to it is literally a Mesa Boogie Mark IV. And if you're looking for the epitome of clean tone, this is where you'll find your JCM 120. A better prepared artist would have put a chorus pedal on this pedal board for such a time as this. So, and of course, as we talked about earlier, this thing gives you the ability to split amplifiers. In order to do that, what you have to do is triple tap this ample logo right here 3 times. I'm leaving this in because we talked about my issues with the interface earlier. There we go, we got it. So you have to do it just right and fast enough in order to make that happen. Once you're there, you can press that to switch between the different channels you are operating on. So let's go ahead and grab something from the crunch area. We're going to go ahead and get let's go with the Morgan. I like that JS12. That was a great tone. So that's going to be Morgan number 5. And then jumping back over, moving from that JC120, we're going to go ahead and grab let's go ahead and grab number 5 for that that JS12, that Morgan Princeton style amp. And then jump back over and let's go for like something really kind of complementary but different. Let's go with a real Princeton. Let's start pretty basic. Let's go real Princeton next to the JS12. Or you can go more unmatched and grab something like that, the AC30 in the 4 position. Or say you like that JC or that AC30, but you want something with more low end to complement it. You can switch back over and grab something like that JC120. Or go the exact opposite direction. Grab that Friedman that I really liked in the Destroy category, number 4. And then pair it with something like that Sovtech in the Gen X section, number 6. And now you have and then at any time you can triple tap to resync them back to one amplifier. So let's go ahead and wrap things up by taking a quick listen to some of the standout sounds in the bass category here, starting of course with number 1, which is just going to be the tried and true Ampeg SVT, or the most kind of classic massive rock bass sound. keeping in line with what we've talked about a ton in this video, the idea that so many of the amp options in here are off the beaten path and things that you otherwise would just not have access to. Let's give a listen to the Sun Beta Bass model, which is an amp that I've never heard of in my entire life, but is a great option for if you want something that really colors the sound of your bass, if you don't want that kind of classic SVT sound or that classic DI sound. And I love that that's the kind of bass amp that I'm never going to get from my go-to kind of workflows here in my studio. The analog pieces I have do not ever kind of focus on an amp like that Sun, nor will it focus on some of the less traditional bass amps from bigger brands like Gallien-Kruger or Mesa Boogie. So let's go ahead and give a listen to the GK amp in this thing, which is a Gallien-Kruger 800 RB. But of course, you have classics like the Fender Bassman, one of the kind of like most iconic amplifiers in rock history. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Ample by Poly. What are the standout amp features in here? What are the amps in this thing that you don't have, but you would love to hear in your guitar rig or studio? And stick around for future videos by hitting subscribe down below. And until next time, thank you for watching.